My parents cut me off from marrying young. Now they want my help after my marriage succeeded and my sisters ended in divorce. Never thought that my decision to marry the love of my life would lead to such drastic consequences with my family. Let me take you back to the moment when everything began falling apart. My name is Olivia, and I married Ethan 25M when I was 22. We had been together since college, and despite the strong connection we shared, my parents, Nancy 55F and William 57M, were never fully on board with our relationship. Nancy and William were traditionalists. They believed I was too young to settle down, especially with Ethan, who didn't fit their mold of the ideal son-in-law. They thought I was throwing away my potential, particularly since my older sister, Samantha 30F, was on the path they approved of, career-focused, independent, and single. But my heart was set on Ethan. And when we decided to marry, my parents dropped a bombshell. They were cutting me off financially. They didn't attend my wedding. No calls, no congratulations, just complete radio silence from the two people who had raised me. I was heartbroken, but Ethan was my rock through it all. We started our new life together with no help from anyone, determined to prove my parents wrong. But little did I know that their opinion of me would eventually come back to haunt them. Ethan and I weren't rich, far from it. He had just started his career in engineering, while I was balancing a part-time job with finishing up my degree in graphic design. The early years of our marriage were tough. We lived in a small apartment, constantly scraping by to make ends meet. Despite the financial struggles, we were happy. We loved each other deeply and refused to let our circumstances or my parents' absence affect our relationship. Samantha, on the other hand, was the golden child. My parents would always brag about her achievements. She had landed a prestigious job in finance, was climbing the corporate ladder, and seemed to have everything going for her. Nancy and William were endlessly proud of her, and I couldn't help but feel like I was the disappointment in comparison. Every now and then, I would receive a message from Samantha, but it was always short and superficial. She was the one still basking in the family spotlight. Meanwhile, Ethan and I were growing closer. We learned to rely on each other in ways that strengthened our bond. We built a life that felt more genuine and fulfilling than I ever could have imagined. Fast forward 5 years, and Ethan's career had taken off. He landed a position at a top engineering firm, and I started my own graphic design business from home, which quickly became successful. We were no longer struggling, and we decided to buy our first home, a cozy but beautiful house that felt like the perfect place to start a family. Life was finally looking up for us. Ethan and I were over the moon. We had proven to ourselves that we could succeed without my parents' help, and the pride I felt in our achievements was immense. Every now and then, I would wonder if Nancy and William knew how well we were doing, but I never heard from them. They hadn't reached out once, not even when they found out we had bought our first home. Their silence still hurt, but I refused to let it drag me down. We were happy, and that was all that mattered. But while my marriage was thriving, Samantha's life had taken a different turn. She had met David, a high-profile lawyer, and they had a whirlwind romance that led to marriage within a year. My parents, of course, were thrilled. They gushed over how perfect Samantha's life was, unaware that the cracks in her relationship with David were beginning to show. Samantha's marriage was far from perfect, though my parents had no clue. On the surface, everything seemed ideal. David was successful, they had a stunning house, and Samantha continued to excel in her career. But behind closed doors, their marriage was unraveling. Samantha confided in me about the struggles she was facing. David was distant, constantly working late, and their relationship had become strained. They fought more often than not, and it was clear that Samantha was miserable. I couldn't help but feel sorry for her. Despite all the tension between us, she had always been the golden child, but now, she was the one whose life was falling apart. The pressure from my parents didn't help either. Nancy and William had high expectations for Samantha, and they didn't even realize how much it was weighing her down. They expected her to be perfect, and any sign of trouble would have been seen as a failure in their eyes. So Samantha kept her problems hidden, and my parents continued to live in blissful ignorance. Eventually, Samantha couldn't take it anymore. She filed for divorce, shocking Nancy and William. They were completely blindsided by the news, unable to comprehend how their golden child's marriage had failed. It was a huge blow to their egos, and they were devastated. For the first time, they were faced with the reality that Samantha wasn't perfect, and it shattered the image they had of her life. My parents called me, out of the blue. After years of silence, Nancy was crying on the phone, telling me how heartbroken she was over Samantha's divorce. I was stunned, to say the least. It had been years since we last spoke, and suddenly, they wanted to reconnect because of Samantha's failed marriage. Part of me was angry they hadn't cared about me when I needed them, but now that their perfect daughter was struggling, they were reaching out. I tried to be supportive, Despite my feelings of resentment, it wasn't easy, but Ethan encouraged me to be the bigger person, so I listened as Nancy poured out her feelings, telling me how hard this had been for them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they only reached out because Samantha's life had fallen apart, and now they were desperate for some semblance of normalcy. Not long after Samantha's divorce, my parents made an unexpected request. They wanted my help. Nancy and William were struggling emotionally and financially. Samantha had been their pride and joy, and now they felt lost. They had invested so much of their time and energy into supporting her and her lifestyle, and they were suddenly facing financial difficulties. They wanted me to help them out. Now that Ethan and I were doing well, I was floored. After all the years of being cut off, after being treated like the black sheep of the family, they now wanted me to step in and save the day. It felt like a slap in the face. Ethan and I had worked hard to get where we were, and my parents had abandoned me when I needed them the most. Now they were asking for my help, and I didn't know how to feel about it. I told Ethan about the situation, and he was supportive. As always, he said it was up to me whether or not I wanted to help them, but he also reminded me that I wasn't obligated to do anything. I had every right to say no if that's what I wanted. I decided to have an honest conversation with my parents about everything. I told them how hurt I had been when they cut me off, how difficult those early years had been for Ethan and me, and how I had to learn to live without their support. I didn't hold back, letting them know that their actions had caused a deep rift between us. Nancy was defensive at first, but William seemed to take my words to heart. He apologized for the way they had treated me, admitting that they had been too focused on Samantha's success and hadn't given me the support I deserved. It was the first time I had heard my father acknowledge any wrongdoing, and it brought tears to my eyes. Nancy, on the other hand, struggled to admit fault. She tried to justify their actions, saying that they were only trying to protect me from making a mistake, but I reminded her that cutting me off wasn't protection, it was abandonment. The conversation was intense, but it ended with a promise of change. My parents wanted to rebuild our relationship, and I was willing to give them a chance, but I made it clear that it would take time. I wasn't going to forget how they had treated me, but I was open to the possibility of healing. Rebuilding my relationship with my parents has been a slow and complicated process. Trust doesn't return overnight, and while I'm open to reconnecting with them, I've made it clear that things won't go back to the way they were. I'm not the same person I was when they cut me off, and Ethan and I have built a life that we're proud of. Without their help, Samantha, on the other hand, has struggled to adjust to her new life post-divorce. She's dealing with the fallout of her failed marriage and trying to rebuild her career. My parents have shifted much of their focus onto her, but now that they've seen how well Ethan and I are doing, they're trying to be more involved in my life, too. It's a strange dynamic, one that I'm still navigating. My relationship with Samantha is strained, and I don't know if we'll ever be close again. There's too much history, too much competition, and too many wounds that haven't fully healed. Forgiving my parents has been one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. I'm not sure if I'll ever fully forgive them for cutting me off, but I've come to a place where I can at least begin to let go of the anger. Ethan has been a huge support throughout this journey, reminding me that holding on to resentment will only hurt me in the long run. Nancy and William have tried to make amends in their own way, and while I appreciate their efforts, I can't help but wonder if they would have ever reached out if Samantha's life hadn't fallen apart. It feels like their desire to reconnect is more about their need for support than genuine remorse for how they treated me. But for the sake of my own peace, I'm choosing to focus on the future rather than dwell on the past. I'm still wary of my parents, but I'm willing to give them a chance to prove that they've changed. Now that I've had time to reflect on everything, I realize that I don't need my parents' validation to feel successful. Ethan and I have built a beautiful life together, one that I'm incredibly proud of. My parents' opinions no longer have the power they once did, and while I'm open to rebuilding a relationship with them, it will be on my terms. As for Samantha, I hope she finds happiness again. Even though we've drifted apart, life has a way of surprising us, and perhaps one day, we'll be able to reconnect. But for now, I'm focused on my own happiness and the future I'm building with Ethan. The road ahead may not be easy, but I've learned that I'm stronger than I ever realized. No matter what happens with my parents or Samantha, I know that I have the love and support of my husband, and that's all I need.